Well, welcome everybody, and welcome to everybody that is watching this online. It's great to have you all here. Some years ago, George Pipe suggested that I go and see Don Price to capture Don's early memories of ringing. I followed up his suggestion, and this formed the basis of a newsletter article. I then planned to interview George prior to the 2019 dinner, but at the last minute he fell ill, so that sadly never came to pass. That would have, I'm sure, been an absolutely fascinating interview to have had. However, the seed was sown by George that our senior members were full of interesting memories which should not be lost. And since then, we've run a series of interviews, mainly on the afternoon before the dinner. Today, I'm delighted that we are joined by Rick Shallcross. Good afternoon, Rick.
Good afternoon, Simon.
So, firstly, tell me where you originate from and why did you start ringing?
Well, I originate from Ashton-under-Lyne. I've been told I have to speak clearly, so if anybody wants any translation from my Manchester accent, please ask. From Ashton-under-Lyne, a fine ring of 12, East Manchester, and I started ringing for money. Pure and simple. My parents were sort of a mixed marriage of Catholic and Protestant, so they thought the best sort of education I could have, so they sent me to a Methodist church, and, which was very good. And from there I met up with a little friend and used to walk to church with him, and one morning he said he couldn't come to church with me, he was going elsewhere, and I asked him why. He said, well, he joined the local choir and they got 5 shillings every 6 months for, this was in 1954-55, so sort of 5 shillings was quite a bit of money then, and neither of us came from families who had any money. And so I started walking down to the choir with him, and then he said, oh, I'm sorry, I can't walk down with you. And I said, why? He said, well, I joined the bell ringers. They get 7 and 6 every 6 months. So I said, well, can you introduce me? And they said, yes, I'll ask. So I went up, and there's a lovely lady called Joan Harrison, Joan Carter, as she was then, and her father had run the ringing, the band had disappeared after the war, and she decided to try and build a band. And over a period of a couple of years, she took in about 20 kids, and most of us stayed, and it was like a youth club. There was an ideal mix of girls and boys, about a third girl and 2/3 boys, so it kept everybody on their toes a bit, and we grew up together. I remember when I got my first payout and I went home and showed my father the money I got, and he was a bit worried. I think he thought I pinched it for himself. Yeah, that's why I started ringing, but I was completely hooked.
And you say some of those other people you learnt with carried on ringing. Are there any names we'd recognise from there?
Well, yeah, let me see. People like, do you see Christine Andrew was there? I sort of really taught Christine to ring. Jeff Brannan was up at Mossley, but he became a very, very good friend, and he used to join us. Not too many recognisable people from those days. Most of them, regretfully, may not be around. Some of them will be. Some of them still ringing, some of them not. But it was the people we soon got out around the other churches and met up with all sorts of interesting people.
Such as? You've mentioned Jeff, obviously. But...
Well, Jeff was sort of the same age as me. But the really, the interesting names that people might have heard of, the very, very famous and talented Ted Jenkins.
Yeah.
He rang the treble to the 15,312 Cambridge Max rung at Ashton in 1929, that sort of time. And Ted was, well, he was wonderful to me. I got on with him very well, and he taught me an awful lot. Well, I like to think he taught me a lot, but it might be questionable. There are some people here who might question what he taught me, but he taught me how to handle ropes and big bells, and the philosophy of how to ring big bells. And he was only several stone, and I mean, you know, for goodness sake, he rang Wells to London Royal. Apparently, he was absolutely finished afterwards, but he was tiny, and he looked like a little chimpanzee. He was, his hair sort of stuck up. He was small. He was obviously had come from foreign parents, I think. And I'm not sure whether anybody really researched his, you know, Chris might have done, but I think he came out of London, there was some Eastern European influence. And I think he sort of came out of London and ended up in East Anglia somewhere. And then, of course, he became quite well known as a heavy bell ringer. He had this wonderful technique of understanding, being with the bell. There are two types of tenor ringers: the ones that dictate what the bell does, and the ones who work with the bell. And Ted didn't have any weight. He didn't have very much strength. He was very wiry. But he would ring a bell a few strokes and he knew all about it. And he was absolutely amazing and very, very good with kids. He came and joined our Sunday service band. But the reason that he came over to live in Oldham was that there was a chap called Fred Dunkley. Fred Dunkley was a mill owner, and he was very. Fred had a bob or two. He was a nice enough chap, and he rang with the Cheshire Band, and I think he spent his money around a little bit as well, but they really wanted Ted to come along and ring with them. We used to say they wanted him along to ring the tenors because he was known then as. So Fred actually gave him a job with the proviso that he had to ring with them on Saturdays and he had to ring the tenors. And he was employed as a carpenter come odd job man in the mill. And he lived in a little 2 up 2 down number 354 Oldham Road. And I can't tell you what I was doing yesterday, but I was pretty good remembering that. And we used to go there on Sunday evenings. He taught me how to ring handbells, and Fred had given him a set of handbells to look after. And he was a wonderful person and an amazingly talented ringer. But he died in penury, and that was sad. I went along to his funeral. I was living I think in Bristol at that stage, and it was sad that he was. Whether he went to a pauper's grave or not, I'm not sure. But I visited him a couple of times just before he died, and it was just amazing to see this wonderful man, you know, with a mask on, trying to stay alive. So there you go. That's Ted Jenkins. Wonderful person. Other wonderful people, again with a sad ending. Anybody remember somebody called Derek Ogden?
Yes.
Derek Ogden was probably one of the top ringers in Britain. He was a lovely man. Had a wife, Joyce, and 2 kids. And Derek could do anything, but he had style. He was Manchester University graduate, and he sort of got us thinking about ideas. ringing spliced had sort of gone out of fashion a bit in those days. We're talking about, I was only about 14 by this time, getting into those sort of things. And it was Derek who sort of really masterminded us going into initially Splice Major, and then looking at compositions of Splice Royal and Maximus, and wondering why compositions are spliced on higher numbers were different. Why were they different? I think it was Wilfred Williams at Reading who rung the record number of, what was it, 11 spliced, and it was a whole course of the first one, and then a call somewhere, and then a whole course of the next one, and a whole course of the next one, and we thought, well, that isn't splice really. So Derek set about trying to compose some what we call proper peals of spliced with different course lengths, extending lead methods, and so we started to look around for methods, which leads me on to something different. So, but just talking about people like John Worth. I don't know whether people remember John Worth. He was a builder from Macclesfield, and he really ran the band that rang in Cheshire. They were a good band, and they rang on 12, but the band that formed in Manchester was, and I have to say this because there's nobody here from them, technically way better, and but we needed one or two of them to fill the gaps, and people like Basil Jones.
Yeah.
I rang in Basil Jones's 513th peal. Does anybody know why that's significant?
Liverpool Cathedral? Was it?
No.
Most of them was one arm.
No. The 500th peal with one arm.
Yeah.
He rang 13 peals. He was a good cricketer, and apparently a ball hit him there. It all went wrong, and he had to have his arm off just below the elbow, and so that was noted in the ringing world, the 513th peal. And I'm not sure whether Basil brought any drinks. He wasn't well known for doing that. He was quite wealthy. Ken Lewis, of course. Another chap who remains a good friend today, Brian Harris, and he's in his 90s now, and he's just a really nice guy. A very embarrassing first meet I had with him. Do you want me to carry on?
Yes, absolutely.
I don't want to be boring.
Not at all.
Yeah. It's not like talking to my wife, who shuts me up very quickly. So, yes, I think I was 14, and Brian Harris used to run a little peel week the first week of the school holidays. I think he was head of maths at Stockport Grammar School, which was, quite a good school. And he rang at Hazel Grove. In fact, I think he might have even been the town master there. Hazel Grove had a very good practice, and it was about 10 or 12 miles away from where we lived. And I was very good friends with Neil Bennett, who still continues, but he's not very well these days, poor old Neil. But mentally, he's all there. And he said, would you like to come along on Brian's week? And I said, yes. So he said, right, I'll contact Brian. And Brian said, well, we'd like to have a look at the lad before I invite him on my peel week. You'll have to bring him over to a practice in Hazel Grove. So of course, it was in the middle of summer, and the sun does occasionally shine in the Manchester area. And it was quite warm, and Neil and myself cycled over there, and we arrived there in the muck sweat. went up into the belfry, and there's quite a few people there. And Brian was sitting there, and he just never said a word. So they said, right, sort of get hold, and we rang something, and so Neil said, you better get hold. So, right. Then we rang a touch of 12 spliced, and so I rang in that, and still there was no sort of sign from Brian. So Neil said, look, he said, I'll take you over and introduce you to him. That's the best thing. He was only like from there to there. And I went over, and Brian sort of looked up, because he was quite a fierce looking bloke. He was a big bloke. And he said, oh yes, and Neil said, well, this is Rick, you wanted to see him. He'd like to come on your peel week. He said, well, he'll have to wash his neck before he comes on my peel week. But I was 14, for God's sake, and had the floor opened, and so I thought, hell, we cycled home, and Neil said, well, at least you're going to be on the peel week. And then I got a message, because we didn't have phones in those days. We just lived in the back street in Ashton, and a little 2 up and 2 down. But a very loving home, and very welcoming home for bell ringers too. And I got a message that I had to ring Brian Harris. And so I thought, what the hell's this about? So I went to the phone box, and you could fiddle around, couldn't you? You could dial a number, and then they give you a ring back on reverse charges. And Brian said, hi, Rick. Yeah, it was very, very friendly. And I thought, oh, well, that's nice, He said, I need a favour. He said, somebody's dropped out. I think it was a peel at Nantwich, which was the first peel of his tour. And he said, I'd like you to ring. And I said, well, I can't. And he said, well, why not? I said, well, it's too far. And he said, it's too far to cycle. It was about 40 miles there and 40 miles back, which was a bit far. So he said, well, you'll just have to come on the train. I said, I can't afford it. And he said, well, in that case, I'll pay. So I borrowed the money from my dad. Where he got the money from, I don't know. And I caught the train. We rang this, well, I got to the town. We rang the peel, and Brian gave me the money, which I then gave back to my dad. So that was, and we've been great friends ever since.
That's fantastic.
I went to his 90th birthday, rang handbells with him, laughed and joked about the dirty neck incident. He doesn't believe he said it, but he did. He did.
That's fantastic.
Other people, sort of, lots of people. There was one chap who, he was either on or off, a chap called Dennis Mottershead. And I rang a lot with Dennis as a young lad. But as Neil Lummers said, that as you all grew up, you all fell out with him. And I think by the time I got to 17, I'd had enough of him, and he probably had enough of me as well, in fairness. So, but we had a lot of fun with Dennis. He was a character. People like Neil Lummers, who's still alive and still ringing handbells. This is terrific. Derek Butterworth, Mike Fishwick, Norman Smith. Used to ring the occasional Sunday afternoon peel with Norman. Ever such a nice chap. And of course Richard Parker.
Yes.
And Richard, the first 7-part peel of Major I rang, and I'm not sure whether it was the first 7-part peel of Major, perhaps Chris or John would know. I rang at Littleborough, and it was a peel of Plain Bob Major, called by Roger Lee. Now, Roger Lee looked like the Mekong in the Damn Dare series. He was an odd man. and but he was obviously clever, and it was not a very flashy composition at all, but it was a 7-part, and I've got a feeling it might have been the first one ever.
I think it was.
And moving on from that, as time went on, Richard Parker, who was taught to ring by Norman, and I'm not doing Norman down here, but Richard did the first 7-part spliced, and he cracked the code for the 23. And in deference to Norman, he backed down, and Norman took the credit. And Richard Parker's a great guy, as Norman was. Very, very nice people. And when you look back to the first time, I was in college, so I didn't ring in the first peal of it. And look at the pleasure that composition has given people, and look what it's done. All the offsprings and into Maximus, it just developed everything.
So to interject here for 1 moment, it's very topical. Actually, Norman Smith's family came to the Bell Foundry at Loughborough the other day and donated Norman's papers, including his composing sticks, his original compositions, all his workings out.
Really?
With the Central Council Library.
Wow.
And the son and daughter are lovely too. It was great to meet them.
Yeah.
Really quite a historic moment to meet the family and for them to hand the stuff over to the council.
Just so people on the streaming could actually hear that, Chris Peter was just saying that that Norman Smith's family donated all of his papers and all the associated pieces to the Foundry archive,
To the
Central Council archive. So that's a lovely record to have. Absolutely superb. Superb. I actually remember ringing with Richard Parker. He was absolutely superb ringer. He hardly ever made any sort of hesitation or fluff. He was absolutely brilliant and just such a lovely person.
Sure.
So I remember ringing with him. You started talking about some of the peels that were developed and the spliced, and when I think of you, I certainly do think of the peels that you've rung. So tell me about some of those peels and some of those series that developed.
Right. Well, I guess we sort of started off ringing the 6 parts of Pitman's, the 7 to 30, is it? And some interesting methods there. And you've got to remember that what we were doing then was the equivalent of what some of the ultra clever kids are doing now. We were all at that same stage, literally, and things move on, don't they, through the ages. So this was all a significant build-up to me failing all my A levels, which is probably the best thing that ever happened to me. But I'll come on to that if we've got time. We started off on the major, and then we were ringing the odd peal of Surprise Royal. Incidentally, the first course of Surprise Royal, Cambridge Royal, I rang was at a meeting in Worsley, where quite an attractive young lady called Gillian Schofield also rang her first course of Cambridge Royal. And therein lies many tales.
We might have time for those as well.
We won't have any time for those. And so it was decided, well, why don't we get on to the Spice Royal? I think some people in Yorkshire, on the darker side of the Pennines, the people who lost the war many centuries ago. Well, I'm expecting support from you, John, the true Lancastrian, and they'd started ringing the off-peeler Splice Royal, and we thought, well, what they can do, we ought to be able to do better. So Derek started with his composing, and we got into Splice Royal, and then there was. We decided to. I think we rang the first all the work peal of spliced Maximus, and it was 3 spliced: Cambridge, Yorkshire, and Lincolnshire. I've got to be careful what I say here now, but it was a mixed band. With the Manchester band and some of the Cheshire men, we just formed the band, and but it wasn't quite the band yet. Ken Lewis was calling, and Ken was a head down chap, and I wouldn't say he was oblivious often to what was going on around him, but he was very good, and he did great things in bringing them on to London Royal, when bringing London Royal was really quite high flying. And there was a lovely old gent called Peter Laughlin. Anybody heard of Peter Laughlin?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I think he came from Suffolk, and Peter was ringing the 11th, and he had this lovely style. He never pulled the bell, and the bell, a bit like Ted Jenkins used to do on the tenor, but Peter was just stroking the bell round. And we got into, we were ringing away, and suddenly Peter's all over the shop, and Ken just kept his head down. Everybody shouting at Peter to, do this, do that, and he sort of got to the lead end, and Peter gets in the right place, and Ken Lewis sort of shouts out something like Cambridge. He sort of yells out Lincolnshire, and Peter said, "I'd just be ringing Lincolnshire." And it was just made everybody smile. There was no harm in it. But who hasn't been there? Who hasn't been there? So we went to the town hall, and Derek produced this peal of Maximus. But in producing this composition of Maximus, we had to look around for methods. And Derek had decided that we didn't want to fiddle around. And he decided he was going to go for quite a high number. And the number turned out to be 18. And it was going to be done on what we thought were traditional lines. So we looked at Bristol Max. Now, Bristol Max hadn't been rung really for years. And we looked at it and said, "Oh, that's rubbish. Absolute rubbish. It doesn't have an extending lead. It's no use to us." And look at it, funny lead end, and they just threw it out. And we didn't ring very much Bristol. We didn't ring very much Stedman. It wasn't an odd bell ringing area. It was all even bell ringing. And so Stedman hardly rang any. We rang a peal of Stedman for Derek Ogden's funeral. And Ted Jenkins rang the tenor. I know I was ringing next to him, and I looked round halfway through, and the tears were coming down his face. So Derek was very well regarded by everybody. And so Bristol was thrown on one side, and we invented Redfield and Brigstow. We rang quite a bit of Londinium, which is a poor method, but it was a London method. And then we had Lambeth, which was a slightly better method, which went into the spliced. And we wrote out our own extending lead methods, and that's how we came round to ringing the 18.
And a big ring of bells would do something like that, or?
Yeah, well, the town hall were run by the police in those days, and they had a band of 6 ringers, and those ringers were paid to practice one morning a week. And so they'd nip upstairs, and whatever they did or didn't do, that was part of their job.
Wow.
And for special occasions, we used to go down there so that we could ring all 12. But the place was run on military lines by a chap called Dick Benson. He was a sergeant there, and the place was immaculate. The bells were so easy to ring, and of course, as everybody knows who's rung there, they really are truly very good. Yeah, so we would go to the town hall to ring certain things. We not a tragic incident happened there, but it reflects on several people that the Cheshire band had managed to get permission to go down to ring Exeter, and they decided, I think it was, they got their tenor man sorted out, and I thought, he'll never do it. But anyway, they were going to go down and have a go. So they decided they were going to have a practice peal at the town hall. And I wasn't going to go down to Exeter because that was an overnight stay and expensive. But I rang in the practice peal, and Ted Jenkins said that he would ring the tenor at the same speed that it would probably take them at Exeter, to give them a good idea as to what it was like to ring heavy bells slowly. So so Ted comes in, jumps on the box. He's got a suit on, his grey suit. He's got a waistcoat buttoned up. He's got a tie on. And the tenor ringer, supposedly tenor ringer, rang the 11th. And Ted rang the tenor in 4 hours, 20 minutes. And he was as fresh as a daisy when he finished. His tie was still in an immaculate knot. His buttons were still done up on his waistcoat, and his suit jacket was still on. And the chap on the 11th pulled all his stomach muscles, and so they couldn't go to, because the 11th was a bit of a notorious bell, and at that speed it just did him down. But that was how good. So I've lost the thread now.
So
I'm rambling.
that's great. It's lovely. That's great to go off on tangents. So that band. So you said you rang the 18 at Manchester. Now you went on to ring more spliced.
Yeah, we did.
And at Liverpool.
Yeah, we went again. We'd started to progress from the 18, and then I'd left to go down to Coventry, but I came back because they wanted to ring 40 spliced, and they decided that they got permission to ring at Liverpool, and they thought, well, we might as well have a go at ringing the splice there. So we did, and Jeff and myself rang the tenor to that.
How many spliced?
40.
40?
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was, well, Joe Ridyard came to let us in, and he stayed throughout the whole peal. He thought it was worth his time to sit down and listen. So my recollections of it were that it was okay.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And then we went to Nottingham, and we went for, I think it was 60. And we rang the peal, only for a few days later for Neil, who, after Derek had died, Neil had taken on the composing. And he decided, for some unknown reason, to swap two methods round, which he thought were fine, and it had run false. So that was the false peal at Nottingham. And then I was out of it, but they went on to ring the 110. And yeah, they were a good band, and the ringing was pretty good. Yeah, pretty good.
So how many peals have you rung in total?
About just over 2,500.
And a lot of them on higher numbers?
Yeah, quite a few. Yeah, quite a few, but not the most. But yeah, I like ringing on 12 especially.
Any particular ones that stand out?
Yes, there's uh, there's some of them stand out. I suppose the Newport peel was probably the one which sort of sticks in my mind when I just beat Chris Kipping to being the youngest person to ring the tenor to surprise Maximus. But Chris didn't mind. You know, we were good friends, and I was just 17 then. So that one, I mean, there were so many good ones, and blimey, someone, gosh, just looking back, sort of there were one or two that I really enjoyed, but never quite had the same amount of what's the word, sort of respect given to them. And it was the peal of Stem and Sinks when I was supposed to be ringing the tenor at St Paul's to Bristol and Stedman, and Rod had got the bells, and he said, "Yeah, come along and ring the tenor." But it was a time when he wasn't feeling very well, and at the last minute he stood out, and also at the last minute I think it was the Queen Mum popped her clogs.
Right.
And we were told that we were having to ring Stem Sinks, half muffled, which is, I mean, to hear St Paul's bells is one of my joys, because they are different and they are good. To hear them half muffled is something else, and it's quite an emotional experience to actually not only to ring them, but even I remember sitting outside in Paternoster Square one dinner day, which corresponded with when the bells were going to be half muffled, and listen to them, and they really sound something else. I think old bells, half muffled, sound much better than these modern ultra-tuned bells when they're half muffled. That's just my opinion.
So you've rung the tenors at Liverpool and St Paul. Have you rung all of the big tenors?
No, there's one or two left. Adelaide, they'd only let me on the 7th there because Jeff grabbed the tenor. He said he'd organised it and he was ringing it.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. Adelaide, Inverary, I haven't rung. Again, when the boys were going up in the 60s, it was beyond my reach. And Beverley Minster, again, I've only run the 9th there. But those three, fair enough. I've been lucky enough to ring the rest, so I'm quite happy.
Yeah.
And other peals that stand out. I mean, there were so many good ones, but just recalling them, when you've rung your first peal of Surprise Max, that's pretty good.
Well, there's one that obviously comes to my mind that you were in. It's the 40,000.
Well, yeah, that's the one that when we finished that peal, there was no elation because everybody was so knackered. I remember shouting across to one of the umpires in the evening. We'd still got half a dozen hours to ring. I said, "You've got to get some beer in for when we finished." And they did go and buy a crate of beer, and they put it at the bottom of the stairs. I think it would have been too tempting had they brought it up and put it there. And I remember going downstairs with John Robinson as soon as we'd stood, and we each opened a bottle of beer. I couldn't drink it. No.
That must be the first time you've not been able to drink beer that's been in front of you.
Yes, it was. Yes, that's true. I remember it in our local pub in Ashton, the Pitt and Nelson, having my 18th birthday party, and the landlord came into where we all were, and he said, "Hey Rick, sort of, what's the occasion?" And I said, "It's my 18th birthday." And he said, "You little bugger, you've been drinking in here for years." So that was that was the pit and Nelson. I digress again. There was the long period. Oh yes, the 40,000. Yeah, that was it. Derek Ogden. We'd been ringing somewhere around Manchester a couple of weeks before the 40,000 was about to take place, and they'd lost it a couple of times before, and several other people had lost it for different reasons.
I remember I used to ring with Norman Harding a lot, and he'd been in some of the attempts for it.
Oh, yes, Norman Harding.
He used to tell me about it.
Up and coming ringers. Remember that?
Yes.
So we were coming out of a tower, and I was walking with Derek, and he said, wonder whether you mind doing me a favour. He said, I'm not feeling very well. I've got to go into hospital for some tests. And he was in the 40,000. He said, would you be prepared to ring in my place? And I said, well, when is it? He said, oh, it's in a couple of weeks' time. And I said, well, okay, you better ask Bob. And he said, well, I've spoken to Bob, and he says, all right. I mean, I was fit as a butcher's dog then. I was cross-country running and doing all sorts of sports. And so I said, yes, I'm fine. And that's how I ended up ringing in the 40,000. Derek came and picked us up, drove us down there. We stayed overnight. Regretfully, I drank 1 or 2 cups of tea too many at breakfast in the morning, which came to say hello to me later in the pill. And
well, someone did ask me to ask you about the bucket.
Oh dear, yeah. well. I apologise to the audience, but yes, it's funny watching all the others, and I was feeling pretty smart, because by the time we got to about 35,000, I'd seen everybody have a bit of a funny turn. And I saw one, it's the first time I'd ever seen a person go green. I didn't think it was possible, but he went green. And fair play to the guy, he just carried on going. And Brian Harris was having trouble eating any food, because Brian was a very sort of straight ringer. Everything had to be. And we'd been ringing quite a long time, and I think we'd all been eating. They got these little shelves put up around the side. They'd all been having a sweet or whatever, and Brian was not eating. And I think Bob said, "Brian, you ought to eat something." And Brian said, "Oh, it's okay. Brian, you really ought to eat something." And Brian said, "Well, I'm not very good ringing one-handed." So he said, "Well, you've got to try." So Brian was sort of being quite tentative, and he made a grab, and he flicked this boiled sweet, and it shot across the room like a bullet, narrowly missed the treble ringer, and smashed against the sort of wall. It was in pieces on the floor. It was anyway. I was feeling pretty smart about 35,000, thinking, I'm actually going to get through this. And then suddenly I started to feel a bit strange and getting a bit dizzy. And I thought, what the heck's going on? So I thought, well, I'd better just warn Bob. And I said, "Bob, I'm not feeling too well. I'm not going to stop, but I'm not feeling very well." And he said, any idea why? I said, no, I just feel a bit dizzy. And he said, "You probably want to pee." So I said, "I don't know." So he said, "You've got to have a pee." Right, okay. So Peter Stanleyforth, who was sitting there, a lovely chap, Peter. I said, well, okay. So I could ring one-handed. So Peter sort of disappears. He comes back with a bucket, and he said, "You've got to pee in the bucket." You see. So I'm ringing away, and I'm trying to get. I don't know whether we had zips in those days or whether it was buttons. We'd certainly progressed from poppers, and. So I was trying to get the zip up, and Peter said, "Do you want me to do it for you?" I said, "No, I'm only 17." And anyway, I managed to get the necessary equipment out, and Peter was standing there with this bucket. He said, I said, "Put it on the ground." He said, "No," he said, "I'll hold it." Oh, poor old Peter. I don't think very much went in the bucket, but Peter was in a bit of a state. And, it's something that I've seen when we've, kind of self-felt with scouts and sort of kids and all sorts of things. It was instant. It felt as fresh as a daisy within 15, 30 seconds.
Yeah, it's probably getting rid of the horrible things that.
I don't know what
it
was,
yeah.
but it was, it sort of, it made people smile as well at the end of a long day. And then, of course, we didn't finish till in the early hours of the morning. And when we went outside, a policeman stopped us and said, "Excuse me, what are you people doing around here?" And we explained to him, and he was quite happy. And then Derek Ogden now drove us home, and that was July. September he was dead.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Yeah. So sorry about that. That's but he's a wonderful person, and that's how it went. So by that time, gosh, what else was? Oh, there were so many things going on. I was playing lots of football and cricket, cycling around all over the place, ringing bells, not doing any work. Got a few O levels. Got a glowing headmaster's report in the lower six. Why on earth he gave me that, I do not know. Sort of life trickled on.
You said earlier that you didn't get your A levels, and that was the best thing that happened. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think if I'd have gone to university, then I think the way that universities were run, I'd have gone completely off the rails. I was pretty well off the rails then. I went to, it was a cat. I think I was pretty smart, because it did occur to me in the upper sixth that I was more interested in enjoying myself than working. And I'd been accepted at 2 or 3 universities to do metallurgy. The reason that I was going to do metallurgy is that we had a history teacher who was our careers man, and he asked me, he said, "What would you like to do at university?" I said, I think I'd like to do chemistry, sir." He said, "Well, I don't think you ought to, because you're no good at it." And so he said, "There's something called metallurgy. They don't want very high qualifications for that at present." He said, "It might just suit you." And I said, "Well, I've never heard of it, sir." He said, "Well, here's a book. Go away and read it." And I've been a metallurgist all my life, and I managed to get in, having come out with just 1 A level, which happened to be maths, which was taught by John Partington. Anybody remember John Partington?
Yeah.
Well, John Partington was he came to join our school when I was in the upper sixth, and he sort of taught us maths. and that was the only one I passed. He also started, wanted to start a handbell team. He, Jeff Brannan and myself used to ring some Bob Miner on handbells in the lunch hour occasionally, and John decided he wanted to get a tune group going, and he got a load of the fourth form girls, so I went along, of course, first, and whilst the girls were great, I wasn't much into tune ringing, but he'd established us, and many years later I got a call. I forget who it was now, and he said, I'm so-and-so from the handbell ringers of Great Britain. He said, we're trying to ring a cowbell peal, and we'd like you as one of the first members of the handbell ringers of Great Britain. I said, I'm not. He said, you are. He said, he said, it's where the handbell ringers of Great Britain started, in Ashton Grammar.
Wow.
And I said, well, I only went along there for the girls. So that was John Partington, and and out of that little tranche, I persuaded the girls, and we taught them all how to ring at the parish. And there were people like Christine Andrew was one of them, and we sort of taught her to ring. Unfortunately, John gave her first lesson, and she never recovered from the way that he taught her to hold the rope on the backstroke. And that flaw remained with her ringing all the way through her ringing career, although she was a very fine ringer. So that was the handbell rings. I digressed again.
That's great. That's wonderful.
You really ought to keep me on the right track.
No, that's a perfect track. So, was it your work that, because you've lived at lots of places around the country and moved around, was it work that took you round?
Yeah, not sort of lots. I was, like I said, I was lucky to go to the Lanchester because during my 7-year stay there, the first thing is that when I went to the Lanch, my first idea is, well, where am I going to ring for Sunday service? And also, I knew that somebody who I'd known very well from Lancashire, Maril Crosthwaite, now Maril, God knows what, Maril, Maril, oh gosh, I forget her name. But Chambers, that's it, thanks John. Who was doing a teacher training course in Canley Teacher Training College, which is now it's now the teacher training unit for Warwick Uni. And so I used to go over there, we used to have cups of tea together, and I got invited to a hall party with a couple of other ringers, went along, and there was this little girl who was dressed up as a sort of a bunny girl. I thought, bloody hell, she looks all right. And 58 years later, we're still married.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
How she stuck it, I don't know.
She doesn't ring, does she?
I taught her to ring, and she was one of these annoying people who just picked it up and picked up plain hunt and got into bob doubles and then just said, I really don't like this, and just packed it in. So that was probably as well, because you can have too many ringers in the family, I think. So that was one big plus of Coventry. I went along to Aldesley Sunday service ringing, and there in the churchyard was Pete Border, who used to come up to see his girlfriend, who used to live in Bowden, and he used to ring peals with us around Christmas time. And I said, hi Pete, what are you doing here? And he said, well, it's more of what you're doing here. He said, because I'm the head ringer here. She said, oh right, okay. So he was wonderful to me. and he said, look, he said, why don't you come along? Would you like to ring a peal in Brum? And I said, well, I would. I'd run lots of peals before I got down there. And he said, well, I'll come and pick you up next Thursday and introduce you to George. So I said, right, okay. And so Pete used to drive into town, and he picked me up outside college after lectures, and took me to Brum, and we got in the belfry, and they were going to ring a peal on the front eight. They used to do that quite a bit back in the 60s. They were sort of, the organisation was a bit haphazard. George had his way, and George ruled. And if George was losing his grip, he used to split, he used to divide and rule. He was a crafty sort of chap, George. Anyway, Peter said, "This is Rick, you see," and the ringers were coming in the belfry, and suddenly this apparition appeared at the door, and not that I've ever been attracted to women, and it was Sue Funnell in the heyday. Bloody hell. You know, what's this? Hair all frizzed out, looking like $1 million. And she comes in, she was the last in. And anyway, George turned around to me, he said, they were ringing Runnymede, a funny method. He said, do you know this method? I said, no, George. Ring the treble then. I said, no, George, I've just come along. I'm just going to go and have a walk round. You've got your band here. No, he said, you were here. You were in the first 8 here. That's how we do it. You ring the treble. So I said, and I knew who the last person in was. It was the apparition. And so behind George, there's Peter going, ring the treble. So I rang the treble, and Sue sat in the belfry all the way through the peal on the bench. And that was how George did things. Well, at least it gave me a reason to chat to her after. In fact, we became great friends and remained friends for a long time. And, you know, I was so apologetic, and she said, it doesn't matter, it's how we do things. Then we got in the pub, and you could see that some of the ringers there were not happy with not just that, but the situation. And they said to George, look, George, you know, you've got to improve on this. It's no good. And George was, and they said, no, we want a fixed team. You know, we've come to ring on 12. You know, it's got to be better. So George said, well, all right, you see. So he went around the sort of table and he said, you come in, you come in, you come in. He pointed to me and said, you come in. And Peter nodded. So I said, who, me, George? He said, yeah, you come in. I said, yeah. And that's how I got in the Birmingham band. But the ringing was fabulous then. Not very complicated. I mean, we did get on to Londinium, but we rang a lot of, you know, easier methods, a lot of Cambridge. George liked superlative. And then they decided we would get on to Londinium. Well, I was a bit of a star there because I'd run 2 or 3 peals of it, you see. So I was considered to be knowledgeable about Londinium. Anyway, Rod, that's when I started making friends with Rod. Rod was a very important part of the Birmingham band. And there's many people here will not understand why. Rod was the sweetie man. And he used to bring a carrier bag of misfit chocolates every week to the belfry that cost us about £1 for a big bag. And that was his most important task. And then he called appeal, occasionally. And I remember it was one of the London appeals, and George had said, "You're going to call it." You see, I said, "Oh, okay, right." I'll sort of call it. I thought, right, it better be on my best. And I was ringing on the front end somewhere. Rod was next to me, and we were ringing away. And I was feeling pretty smart. You know, I'd have to make 1 or 2 corrections, and I was thinking, you know, I'm the bloody kiddie. You know, this is good. And Rod leant over and he said, "Listen to your backstrokes." So that was you know, we got on like a house on fire, and many years on, that was good. And then I got invited into again, Birmingham was a great leveller, and we rang the 16,000 and odd Cambridge Max, and George had said, you're going to ring. And I had to travel by bus from Coventry for that. And after the peal, I think Rod and George had sat outside and on the roof and done the umpiring or whatever. Not John MacDonald, John Anderson was there with them. And afterwards, we're feeling pretty tired. It was a very hot day, as was the 40,000, amazingly hot day then. And again, I was feeling quite pleased. And John Anderson and George came over, and John said, "Well done, Rick. But the way you handle the backstroke is not very good." He said, "You were just overlapping a bit on your..." I thought, "Oh, bloody hell, I've just been ringing for 12 hours." But that was typical Birmingham. And I loved that, because every peal, even now, I've been lucky enough to ring there this year, and the first thing is, I'm always grateful to be asked. And when I go there, I'm nervous. And when you ring in Birmingham, you give 100%. There's nothing less. And that's how it ought to be. I like that bit of tension. I like the bollockings that are handed out. Oh, excuse me, but that's what it is. That are handed out for people who are slipshod, particularly people who can be visibly seen to be not trying 100%. The sort of kindness that goes into people who are trying to get through a difficult peal for the first time, where they're helped. There's a story that was recalled at Peter Border's funeral by John Anderson. John Anderson was a fine ringer, and they were going for a peal of Cambridge Major at Bishop Ryder's church in Birmingham, and John Anderson, who was just feeling his way into Cambridge at that time, was down to ring the treble. And they turned up, and somebody had dropped out, and they got somebody else in who could only ring the treble. So Peter had said to John, because Peter was ringing, he always rang the flipping. You couldn't get anywhere near a tenor if Peter was in the band, but he was good. And he said, "Right, John, you ring the 7th. I'll look after you." And John said, "I don't know the method." So it's okay. Ring the 7th. And Peter told him all the way through the sort of first course, and probably some of the second course, And then John said, I was starting to get into it. And he said, we sort of got almost to the end of the piece, he said, and I made quite a bad mistake and got myself right. And Peter just leant over and said, "You've forgotten the method already, boy?" And that was, it was just, terrific stuff. And I was so grateful and remain to this day grateful of ringing in Brum. Yeah.
Fantastic.
It's good. It's good. And there's only one bell in this world that's worth ringing. And that's the tenor. Amazing. Yeah. Good.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, Rick, I'm conscious of time and we have
Yes.
a dinner to go to. I could sit and listen to you for hours.
And-
It has been absolutely enthralling, and I'm so grateful you've been so generous with your time to share all those absolutely magnificent memories. So thank you very much. That has been magnificent.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.